yeah, Atlanta's an interesting place.
I lived so during the 7 years I was there, I was in, yeah, I mean, I actually just, while looking up the address just to see what was still there or not, I found that the place that we were renting from a guy who had taken a job out in Silicon Valley or something, is now $750,000. And I mean, I
Yeah.
think there's still a trap house across the street from it, which is kind of
Uh-huh.
wild, but it just was this kind of the rapidity by which like social stratification happens, just even on the level of just like crossing a street corner, or
Totally,
it
totally.
was just, yeah, no, it was a strange place.
Yeah, I mean, and I'm sure if you were to come back now, it would like whole swaths would be unrecognizable. It really, I mean, even like going away for a summer or a couple of months, you come back and it's like it's this uncanny feeling of like, I think I know this block, but like there's now like an artisanal pickle shop right
Okay,
here that
yeah.
where it used to be like someone like an affordable housing complex or something. But coming from New York, and you guys are based in New York now,
We're in
or
We're
Philly.
outside of Philly.
oh,
Yeah.
you're outside Philly. Okay.
Yeah. But
Um,
Patrick's from New York, and I did my doctoral work in New York, so it
okay.
is still
Okay. So
kind
you,
of our like closest city
Yeah.
in a lot of,
yeah,
yeah, closest to our hearts, I guess.
yeah. I mean, so
Sorry
much
to
of
our
what we're
fellow
seeing here is
Philadelphians.
not like it's not strange to anyone who's seen like the transformation of like Bushwick or all of these areas in Brooklyn where yeah, similarly like you walk across the street and you're in like another life expectancy,
Yeah.
just walking across the street or something.
Yeah, no, it really struck me. I mean, I've only been to Atlanta a couple of times, although I really enjoyed it when I was there. And it was mostly for like things being like, oh, Patrick, hey, you finished your PhD. We should probably go
Yeah,
down there
surprise.
so you
Somehow
can
made it. So let's go.
so you can walk,
Yeah.
right? But it struck me that so much of the book, and we'll get into this more, but like is about the vanished and like the vanishing, because so much of it is about like the systematic undercounting of who counts as homeless, right?
Yeah.
Who counts
Yeah.
as unhoused, and how there's been this like prestidigitation around that, like not only in terms of like quantitative like data collection, but also like in the collective consciousness, imagination. I'm not trying to sound like a Jungian here, you know what I mean?
Yeah. Yeah. Yeah.
Like,
Yeah. Totally.
but it's mirrored in the same way in that, like, I think the older you get also, but in addition to like the sort of just runaway speed of development that you're
Hmm.
discussing, there's become something just like uncanny about like the vanishing of places, and of places that it's one thing to be like, I have a sentimental attachment to an artisanal pickle shop, right? It's another thing to
Yeah.
be like, generations of my family have lived in this apartment complex, and
Yes.
now it is gone, and it lives on only in memory.
Totally, totally. Yeah, I don't know if you guys saw, there's a book that just came out, sort of adjacent to Abundance. Yoni Applebaum, he's an Atlantic writer, and it's called Stuck. And the
Mm.
whole thesis is that, like, what makes America great is like the ability to move, and that has been impeded by same sort of argument as Ezra Klein, by like progressive policies that have blah blah blah. But like, I just hate the premise that it completely negates and ignores like people's desire to remain,
Yeah.
the vanishing sort of right to remain,
Yeah.
and to be rooted somewhere, to inhabit a place like that generations of your family have also inhabited, and like to have an attachment to place and a sense of like. So yeah, absolutely. I mean, I think that is what is so heart wrenching, is just like constantly meeting people who are just like, I mean, Britt in the book is sort of the ultimate exemplar of that, I guess, but just, sort of less extreme versions of people who are just like, I really thought I could make a home here and I can't. But that title, like, there's no place for us. Like, the sort of devastating fact of that title is that it's not like there isn't elsewhere to run to, you know, like a more affordable, more viable elsewhere. Like like that no place is like at the scale of like the country at this point, basically, you know, or at least in people's own awareness and imagine, you know, whether there's like some county in Iowa where someone could afford, you know, but it's like in their imagine, it's like there is nowhere else for me.
You're listening to Ordinary Unhappiness, a podcast about psychoanalysis, politics, pop culture, and the ways we suffer now. I'm Abby Kluchin.
I'm Patrick Blanchfield.
And today I am really excited to introduce our guest, Brian Goldstone. Brian is a journalist whose long-form reporting and essays have appeared in the New York Times, Harper's, The New Republic, the California Sunday Magazine, and Jacobin, among other publications. He has a PhD in anthropology from Duke University and was a Mellon Research Fellow at Columbia University. In 2021, he was a National Fellow at New America. And his most recent book, which is the occasion of our conversation today, is There Is No Place for Us, Working and Homeless in America. It is an absolute tour de force, and you should all go out and buy it. And Brian, thank you so much for being with us today. Welcome.
It's such a privilege to talk to you.
I just want to interject immediately and say, if you're listening to this interview and you haven't bought the book yet, I would just recommend buying this book. And I want to put this out there immediately just to register with the audience and also with you, Brian, just that it's a remarkable text in its own right as just a literary achievement in terms of its style, but also as a piece of reportage and social analysis. It's, I think, a thing that you could give to pretty much anyone in your life.
Yeah.
And with who is capable of reading anything in nonfiction and they will get something out of it. And so to the extent to which our audience I know likes to buy books and likes to buy books for other people, I want to plug they're doing that. And I also want to say this, we may engage in some slight sort of spoilery type stuff, but that doesn't even seem like quite the right word, since what we're talking about are like actual people's lives. And if anything, the things getting really spoiled are like fantasies and narratives of that are much bigger than any one individual. But in any event, independent of anything that we could or couldn't spoil, the book is worth reading in its own right. So please just get it. And the audiobook version, I also wanted to say, is phenomenal. The narrator for that does an amazing job.
There are so many places that we want to take this conversation. It is such a rich book. I was saying before we started recording that I was up till like almost midnight talking to my mother about it on the West Coast. And again, yeah, I think it's a book that is, I hope it finds a really wide audience, because I think it is not only just like devastating, but also just like compulsively readable. Like it's not a short book, and I realized that I hadn't moved for like 6 hours at one point. I'm sitting on the couch reading it. And so we're so excited to talk to you about the project as a whole. Can you tell us a little bit about like the origins of what came to be this book, and also about your methodology in reporting and writing it?
Yeah, absolutely. So in around 2018, my wife, who's a nurse practitioner, she was working at a community health center here in Atlanta where we live. And she was noticing this trend among her patients at this community health center. It's called Mercy Care. One patient after another, she would talk to them and learn that they were like, you know, working at Walmart or McDonald's, or driving for Uber and Lyft, or packing boxes at an Amazon warehouse, or working as home health aides or daycare workers, all these jobs. And when they finished their shifts, they weren't going home to an apartment. They were going to homeless shelters if there were any shelter beds available. They were sleeping in the overcrowded apartments of others. They, in one case, the person was sleeping in a tent, or they were sleeping in the very cars like they had just done a run to the airport in their Uber and Lyft in, like they would sleep in that car after finishing their shift. So she just noticed this trend and she was stunned by it. And when she told me about it, I was stunned. As a relatively educated person, and as someone who like first as an anthropologist and then when I became a journalist, like someone who had like reported on inequality and poverty, both in America and internationally. Like I had read a lot about homelessness. I had read books about homelessness. When my wife told me about this phenomenon she was seeing, I typed the words working homeless into an academic search engine, just wondering like what kind of literature exists on this phenomenon, this link between work and homelessness. And I was shocked that like there was virtually nothing that explicitly sort of thematized that relationship. And if anything, when work was discussed in the literature on homelessness, it was negatively. One of the seminal texts on homelessness, Peter Rossi's Down and Out in America, which came out, I believe, in 1989, he has this kind of famous formulation that those who are homeless in America are, quote, unconnected to the world of work. So I think I kind of had that intuitive assumption as well. And it just sort of led me to wonder, like, how common is this that you could be working and working and working some more and it's not enough, forget about getting rich and like buying a mansion. It's not enough to even like secure your most basic material needs, a place to live. And so I ended up reporting a story for the New Republic magazine over a period of about 7 months, following a family here in Atlanta. In the course of reporting and writing that story, I saw that like all these dynamics began to emerge that were themselves really startling. Like it began to be clear that all these families and individuals, they weren't like falling into homelessness, they were being pushed into homelessness. Like there was this entire system that was militating against their stability. And specifically, I realized that like this crisis of the sort of dramatic rise of the working homeless, of housing precarity, it was the product not of a failing economy but a thriving economy. Atlanta, like many cities across the country, has over the last decade or so undergone this like much celebrated renaissance, this transformation of its urban center. And that trend in Atlanta has really been mirrored and replicated in cities across the country, in Nashville, in Charlotte, in Austin, in Phoenix, and any number of cities. Unemployment was at a historic low, corporate profits were surging. And, paradoxically and really perversely, the very people whose labor was producing those profits, the very people whose work, whose labor was like powering the very boom, the very growth that was being celebrated in these cities, were being pushed not just out of their neighborhoods, but increasingly out of housing altogether. That was what happened with the family I wrote about in that New Republic story. And when I finished that story, I realized I wanted to like keep going with this. I realized I had only scratched the surface of kind of what there was to know about this phenomenon. And so that led me to write this book, to expand from one family to 5 families, still based in Atlanta, still based in the city, again, whose success, whose renaissance has really come at the expense of its poor and working class population. There's a line from Toni Morrison. It's from a commencement speech she gave, I believe, at Sarah Lawrence College, and she says, envision what it would be like to know that your comfort, your fun, your safety are not based on the deprivation of another. And like that line, when I encountered it, really became almost like the epigraph to this book without it actually being the epigraph. It became sort of the guiding orientation, is just examining the ways that like all these things that we, and I use we advisedly here, that we love about the new American city, all the green space and the transformed industrial spaces that are now fun and like, boutique hotels and all that stuff. And like that, all of that is predicated on the deprivation, not of people who are on the fringes of society, but again, the people who are actually making that stuff possible. You also asked about my methodology in the book.
Yeah.
So, drawing on my training as an anthropologist, I approached this book, the reporting for this book, I think less as like a journalist might, and more as I would as an anthropologist, as kind of ethnography. And my intention, my aspiration was just to immerse myself as much as humanly possible in the day-to-day lives of the people who I followed over a period of the reporting itself went like 5+ years. In the book, the time span is about 2 years. But yeah, I just tried to immerse myself in their lives. And when I couldn't physically like be with them, we devised kind of creative ways, everything from like dash cams to capture Kara, one of the people in the book, delivering for DoorDash with her kids in the car. So there was like a dash cam in the car where she was like just recording her thoughts when I couldn't physically be with them, to like having recorders running that they would like send me at the end of the day. And yeah, so like we got kind of creative in terms of like just being able to capture as much as we could of what it just looks and feels like for people when this most basic human necessity is always out of reach.
So you mentioned Kara and also I think Britt, who are two of the folks that you follow. And as you say, you're following like roughly 5 families throughout the book. Can you give our listeners a sense of the folks that you are talking with? And also, and this I guess I mean in a really granular sense, is like what kind of systems they're navigating. Because one of the things that the book does in, I mean, like excruciating detail is demonstrate how all of these interlocking systems, most of which are ostensibly designed to help, actually create a whole other, series of often intractable challenges.
Yeah, absolutely. So yeah, so the 5 families who I focus on, they are all part of the low wage labor force. They are all renters who eventually, in the course of their story, become unhoused, and they're all Black. And I should say that when I started the reporting for this book, I initially had this hope or desire to like check all these different demographic boxes and to achieve this kind of demographic diversity, have the white working class family and so forth. But, as I began to show up at food pantries on Saturday mornings or go to these like homeless service providers, every single person was Black. And I discovered that in a city, Atlanta, that is no longer majority Black, 93% of families experiencing homelessness in Atlanta are Black. In this sort of cradle of the civil rights movement, that is the reality. And I saw that there's an entire history, a long, long history going back to Reconstruction and sort of the emancipation of over 4 million men, women, and children into a country, into a labor economy where they are systematically deprived of ownership rights and forced into an economy of low wages, rent, and debt. That there's this entire history of displacement and dispossession and discrimination sort of fueling that 93%, fueling that disproportionality. So that's why the book focuses on 5 families who are Black, because to do otherwise would be sort of forced in a city like Atlanta. Yeah, and as you mentioned, there are all these systems sort of interlocking to make this crisis possible. I want to be absolutely clear. I mean, even if people like stop listening at this point and go do something else, like I just want to be absolutely clear. Like the reason people become homeless is because they don't have homes. Like the reason we are in the midst of like a historic homelessness crisis is because poor and working class people don't have access to housing they can afford. That is that is why homelessness exists. But there are all these other systems coming together to sort of exacerbate and make more likely that this or that person will be pushed into homelessness. And those systems, everything from healthcare and childcare and labor conditions. It's not just low wages, even though that's a huge part of this. It's that the very nature of work has changed, becoming ever more volatile, ever more precarious. You don't know how many hours you're going to be getting from one week to the next. You don't have any sick leave when, as one person in the book, is diagnosed with ovarian and breast cancer, and she's having to decide whether she goes to work at her warehouse job or does she go to her chemo appointment. There's the child welfare system. There's the homeless service industry, or what is sometimes called the homeless industrial complex, which is, really tasked less with solving and ending homelessness than with managing it. So all those systems are coming together. And, I think I would be remiss not to like just focus on one story and just to like give
Sure.
listeners a sense of what this looks like in reality. I wish I could just tell you about each of the families, because all of their journeys are so sort of singular and illuminate a different sort of aspect of this larger catastrophe. But if I could just tell you about Celeste. Celeste is actually that person I was just referencing who is later diagnosed with cancer. But when the book opens, like her story begins in a really dramatic way. It begins with her rental home burning down. She's driving home from her warehouse job one day. She's just picked up her kids from school, and she gets a call from her neighbor saying that her rental home is on fire. And by the time they make it back to the house, it has been destroyed. It is later revealed that an abusive ex is the one who set fire to the house. She had just taken a restraining order out on him. And the only possessions that she and the kids have left at this point are like a few loads of dirty laundry that she had thrown in her Dodge Durango that morning, intending to go to the laundromat after work, and like the few things that are in the kids' school backpacks. They've lost everything else. And so they're totally, totally traumatized by this episode. And they go to a Howard Johnson hotel near the airport. The Red Cross gives them money for a few nights there. And Celeste is like kind of optimistic that her housing search, getting into a new place, will be relatively brief, but she's just astonished to see that even in the time they've been renting this place, like the ground has shifted under their feet. Rents in Atlanta over a 5-year period went up by over 65%. The city, the metro area, lost 200,000 affordable housing units over a 5-year period, in the midst of this sort of rampant gentrification and, quote, revitalization of urban space. And neighborhoods that were once affordable for people like Celeste were no longer affordable. And so what she thought would be like a quick housing search turned into this protracted and grueling housing search. And she's like calling on favors from every friend, relative, coworker in the city. Can we sleep on your floor for a night or two? Can we sleep in your basement? Sleep on your couch? And, many nights are spent in sleeping in the car, sleeping in parking lots. And during those nights, I mentioned the child welfare system as, sort of part of this ecosystem. Celeste was terrified those nights sleeping in her car, because she didn't know the statistic, but she knew that if a cop knocked on her window, they were likely going to call defects, the child welfare people, the child protective services. And, over a third of child removals in Georgia, as in many states across the country, are the result of what is like officially categorized as, quote, like inadequate housing. So Celeste was terrified during those nights. And finally, she found an apartment that she thought she could get approved for. It would eat up about 90% of her monthly income, but the leasing agent encouraged her to apply. And a few days later, after she applied, the leasing agent called her and said, "Why didn't you tell me about the eviction on your record?" And Celeste is like, "What are you talking about? There is no eviction." Come to find out, when that house burned down, her rental home burned down, she had called her landlord, which was not like a mom and pop landlord. It was a private equity firm called the Prager Group that owned tens of thousands of rental properties across the South. And when she called the Prager Group, they told her that to like move to a different home in their portfolio, she would need to pay not only the current month's rent, but an additional month's rent as well. And she would lose her security deposit on this place that had just burned down. And so she hung up in disgust. And what she later discovered when she was rejected from this apartment months later was that they had filed an eviction against her. And she drove to the house that still hadn't been repaired. And in the mailbox, the sheriff had left an eviction notice. And on that notice had written, served to fire damaged property. So in Georgia, a tenant doesn't have to be notified of an eviction in person. The sheriff can carry out what's called a tack and mail eviction. And by the time Celeste found out about this 3-digit number, her credit score, this 3-digit number that has come to determine whether millions of people in this country have access just to something as fundamental as a place to live, her credit score had been tanked. And she did what countless other families and individuals are doing when they are pushed out of the formal housing market. She went to this extended stay hotel, a squalid extended stay hotel on the periphery of the city. And I think her story is really important. It's easy maybe to hear the story and say, oh, well, she became homeless because her home burned down or because she was the victim of domestic violence. No, like those were part of her story, but the reason Celeste and her kids were pushed into homelessness was, and I think it's important to just be clear, because of a housing system that allows actors like the Prager Group, these private equity firms, to just sort of to run wild and to sort of, a housing system that prioritizes profit above all else, that is sort of premised on this radical power asymmetry between landlords and tenants. That is why Celeste and her kids were pushed into homelessness.
Hearing you narrate her story in the tight way you've done, but also having in mind the narrative of her and the other stories in the text really drives home something to me that I almost want to reiterate in light of what you said. And speaking, I think, to expectations that people may have on this issue, or just as they try to metabolize psychically what I think the stakes of the book are. At no point in the narratives that you relate, I think, could anyone, even the most skeptical reader or the most inclined to take things on a narrowly case by case basis, ever reasonably say, this person did something wrong. Like, this is the thing that they did wrong. They fucked up. They made some sort of mistake. They did something immoral. They did something unethical. They did something imprudent in some sort of way that could either causally explain or let alone morally justify what follows on that. And if you'll permit me just to kind of, again, reiterate that to let the point land, because I think your book is a definitive accounting for this in so many different ways. Even as I think each of the cases you narrate is so full of all these different sort of Kafkaesque contingencies and these bureaucratic double binds and these additional twists of the knife and traps that seem to come with the particular sort of hellhole of non-existent tenants' rights that is Georgia, or the ways in which, like, the credit system is leveraged by all these algorithmic systems, et cetera. Like, it is, I think, undeniable that what you were talking about are situations, and what these people are living are situations that are not case by case exceptions to some kind of rule. Like, they are constitutive of what the actual rule is.
Yes.
And that is merciless.
Yes, absolutely. Absolutely. Just going back to, like, even the methodology of, like, immersing myself in their day-to-day lives, like, there are so many distinctive singular details in each of their stories that were really important, I think, to capture, because even, like, the less flattering, the aspects of their experiences, of their choices, like, many of these people, Kara, Celeste, Michelle, Maurice and Natalia, Britt, like, they are their own harshest critics. Like, any moralizing move we might make in any judgment we might level at them, like they've already leveled it at themselves. Like they are acutely aware of when they've fucked up, and they've internalized even a lot of the judgment, a lot of the shame that is leveled at people who are poor and struggling in this country. But like, and it was important, I think, to capture that, because even just like in a narrative way, or like, you know, it can be dehumanizing to only like pathologize people and to try to, I know, you know, we will get into this a bit more about just like how as a country we have turned homelessness into a matter of like personal pathology.
Mhm.
And that of course is like incredibly dehumanizing. But, you know, there's a lot of like well-intentioned social justice writing, journalism, research, where people are like turned into like human arguments for something, like and they become these like angelic figures who can do no wrong. And I think that's equally dehumanizing. Like that's not what I'm like, that's not what you're like. And so I think it's possible to like show people in the fullness of their humanity and the fullness of their like often contradictory desires and counterproductive desires and motivations and so on and so forth, without like losing sight of these like entrenched, completely intractable structural conditions, forces that at every turn in their journey are just like violently, again, militating against their stability, materially and psychologically. So thank you for that. I think that's a really important point.
You know, one of the feats of the book that I found, and I think this is probably related, but that I found particularly remarkable is, and this is partly a writing style decision. You know, you're intermittently deploying this close third person narration style. And so we as readers have, you know, limited but still like significant access to the interiority of the people you're writing about. So like, for instance, we really get a sense of what you were just talking about, how these folks become their own harshest critics. And it really is a feat because there are a lot of characters. I mean, they're not characters, they're people, but as a reader, you are encountering them as characters, and you get to know them pretty well over the course of the book. And so, you know, part of how that cashes out is that we as readers are able to quite deeply identify with and relate to precisely those folks whom, as you argue in the book, those folks who are being written out of both the statistics and the mainstream narratives of unhoused people in the US. So I was hoping you can speak to how, since like roughly the Reagan era, the formation of certain compelling but fundamentally inaccurate narratives about homelessness has come about, and about why and how working people have been excluded from this narrative, both qualitatively and quantitatively. And also, you know, given the concerns of this podcast, we are particularly interested to hear about the ways in which, here I'm going to quote you, as you write, quote, "The main strategy was to link homelessness with mental illness and addiction. And as such, quote, individual pathology became the dominant frame for understanding homelessness, diverting attention from structural factors like poverty or racism. Meanwhile, the fastest growing segment of the nation's homeless population were children under the age of 6, close quote."
Yeah, yes. I've tried to be like more and more kind of rigorous with the language I use to talk about this project. And one of the ways that shows up is like, for a long time, I would talk about this entire world of homelessness that is kind of out of sight and invisible. That really is what my book is about, you know, this, and it's really trying to argue that what we see on the street what we see in shelters is just the tip of the iceberg. And in some ways, like my book is about this much bigger part of the iceberg that is under the water surface that we're not seeing. And just like numerically and phenomenologically is like actually constitutes like homelessness in America, but it is out of sight. And but the way I've been trying to like hone my language a bit is not just talking about it being like this invisible population, but a population that has been rendered invisible. That this is like an active production of invisibility. And you alluded to a strategy to link homelessness with mental illness and addiction. And strategy is the right word, because yes, like beginning in the 1980s, when mass homelessness first erupted in the US during the Reagan administration, and again, I think it's important for us to remember that mass homelessness as we currently know it, like has not always existed in this country. Like it is a relatively recent emergence. But when it first exploded in the US during the Reagan administration, there was a concerted effort first to deny that there was even a problem. Like one of Reagan's deputies said at one point, like, there are no people living on the street. And when that effort at like gaslighting the nation became untenable because people just had to look outside, the tactic then shifted to both like simultaneously obscuring the root causes of this crisis and diminishing its scale and severity. There was actually an article that appeared in the journal Science in the 80s called Reagan versus the Social Sciences, because the Reagan administration, in part of its strategy to shape the public narrative and perception of homelessness was to control the kind of federally funded research that could be conducted on homelessness. So like anthropologists and sociologists and others who wanted to, for instance, look at the effects of like the shredding of the social safety net that Reagan's neoliberal revolution had undertaken, the shredding of the social safety net, or the legacy of racist housing policy, or the complete gutting of like the mental health system and all these other systems. People who wanted to study those things and their effect on homelessness were not given the grants, and those who were given the funding were researchers who looked at the links between mental illness and homelessness, or alcoholism and homelessness, or drug addiction and homelessness. And like the National Institute for Mental Health became the main purveyor of knowledge about homelessness in America, to the neglect of all of these other possible avenues of research. So, that effort at what one scholar, housing scholar, Peter Marcuse, he's actually, I believe, the son of Herbert Marcuse. He's an incredible,
Oh shit.
one of our like most neglected, I think, like writers and thinkers on housing in America. He had an article, I believe it appeared in like the Socialist Review in the late 80s or early 90s, and it was called Neutralizing Homelessness. And what he was describing was precisely this deliberate stripping of homelessness of its like properly political economic implications in favor of this kind of depoliticized, account of homelessness where like people's lifestyle choices, as Reagan put it, or laziness, or just their kind of predilection, toward addiction or substance use is what led them to become homeless. That this was all part of an attempt to neutralize homelessness, and it was successful. By the end of the 80s, the New York Times conducted a poll of people at random asking what causes homelessness. And the number one answer was psychological problems. The number two answer was an unwillingness to work. Nobody mentioned housing, not a single person. So yeah, homelessness became reducible to these individual pathologies, these supposedly individual pathologies. And I think it's also important to say that, like, even though deinstitutionalization and mental illness has become sort of the Wikipedia version of how homelessness exploded in the US in the 1980s into the present, even that isn't like an apolitical phenomenon, of course. Like when deinstitutionalization occurred, like community mental health was supposed to take its place and it didn't. And so like it is also just a failure of this, again, like neoliberal experiment in gutting public funding for basic things like mental health services. So even where mental health and addiction and substance use is concerned, like that has many of the same socioeconomic roots as the housing crisis itself and the homelessness crisis. But yeah, that attempt to control the public perception was absolutely successful. The images that circulated in the media all reified that impression, and Time Magazine talked about, quote, sidewalk psychotics. And you know, by 2005, when the federal government began conducting its annual homeless census called the point in time count, that tiny sliver of the homeless population, those who were like visibly on the streets, had come to stand in the public imagination for homelessness itself, and that was codified in the census, which defined homelessness only as those who are on the street or in shelters. Everyone else was sort of written out of existence. Everyone else literally did not count. None of the families I write about in this book would count in that annual point in time count, that annual census. And I argue in the book that the true scale of homelessness in this country, the true severity, you know, as bad as the official numbers are, in the last 2 years have seen the highest level of like homelessness on record according to the official number. As bad as that number is, the reality is exponentially worse, roughly 6 times greater than that official count. So we're talking like about 4 million families and individuals who are deprived of housing right now. And just in Georgia alone, like if you were to gather all of the families and individuals who are excluded from the official count, who are like living in these shitty hotels and motels, not for months, but for years, who are living in their cars, who are crowded in apartments, living in crowded apartments with others. You could fit, if you just gathered the people excluded from the count at like the stadium where the Braves play, you could fill that stadium 3 times over just in Georgia. And that is like duplicated in every single state in the United States, that kind of systematic exclusion. So like, yeah, I mean, that strategy to control the public narrative, it had really fateful consequences, not just on like who is eligible for services, because all of those people who are excluded, they are also locked out of assistance because they don't count as homeless. It's not just that they're excluded from those resources, it's also that our understanding of the true severity and crucially nature and character of homelessness has been incredibly distorted as a result of that.
I'm so struck by your language of invisibility and struggling with visibility versus invisibility. And I think about it too, just in relation to the term homeless, right? Which in its, just as we read it, as we see it, both presents what is obviously the character of the problem, right? Namely, this person does not have a home. It is the presence of an absence. There is no home for this person out there, or they're not connected with the home. And yet, somehow, it will be immediately followed by these sort of discursive modifiers that, like, well, actually, the homeless problem is drug addiction, or actually, it's this other thing. So the thing that's literally named right up front is invoked almost as a segue into the denial of what it obviously is, as though, like, I don't know, a person were if I were to see I guess it would look like a slug, but if I were to see a snail without a shell, I'd be like, damn, that snail is shellless. But of course, that's because it would be there'd be something wrong with that individual snail in its failure to produce a shell for itself. But human beings, like, you need a home that's built by somebody else generally, right? Like there's some other set of contextual necessary conditions for the production of this thing. And yet labeling a person as homeless becomes about them as an individual rather than about the things that might be not providing them with a home.
Yes.
And there's something about that it reminds me of, and if you'll permit me invoking something that's both a little bit Lacan, but also a little bit sort of like Edgar Allan Poe, the story of like the Purloined Letter, right?
Mhm.
Like,
Mm-hmm.
and just to catch everyone in their audience up to speed on this, right? This is one of these classic Poe like pre-Sherlock Holmes style detective stories, and there's the story of a blackmail letter that, the police can't find it, and is the Baron gonna use it to blackmail a queen or what? It doesn't even really matter. But the point is, the letter that's been stolen is literally sitting on top of the mantelpiece in the room that everyone else is tearing apart looking for the thing. And the point there is that by hiding the thing in plain sight, or rather by making the thing available in the center of your gaze or framing, it somehow produces all these structural sort of like, where is the thing? It can't be this obvious. It can't be this obvious. That actually obscures it. And
yes,
I think about this in terms of, and this is again a recurrent preoccupation for us, about the ways in which so much of modern life, and I think the neoliberal turn particularly underscores this, right? Because everything always becomes an individual problem, right? An individual failure of choice. It's a failure of workers to be flexible enough to learn to code, or fail not to learn to code, or not, hang on with the phone long enough to figure out what, the new housing options are, whatever it is. This is kind of litany of individual ascriptions of blame, which, if anything, your work also kind of really puts the lie to, insofar as there's one thing that a lot of these stories show, it's that people they're far more flexible and far more resilient and are constantly trying to find options than I know I would be under similar circumstances. And even when they do, like, eventually hang up the phone in disgust, like, that's the least I would do. And like, there's something about that is just toxic to even suggest. But beyond that, what strikes me is this kind of, again, social alchemy where the suffering of another, or the awareness of someone else's existing in dire straits, a vulnerability in the other, is seen, or is dimly registered, right? The visual is so complicated here. I have this piece like, do we see it? Do we not see it? Do we see it to look over it? Who knows? But we see something happening, or we know something is happening, but because either that is so distressing to us on the face of it, or maybe it activates a certain set of anxieties about us, or maybe it might make us question certain fantasies we hold dear, we immediately take this thing that's happening as a cause rather than an effect. Right?
Yeah.
Like, like the way when you see, I think paradigmatically, when a police officer is beating the shit out of somebody and yelling, "Stop resisting," right? There is this part of sort of like the cop in one's brain that's like, well, they must have done something. Otherwise, why would they be getting the cop beating the shit out of them?
Yeah.
And there is this kind of, particularly with the mental health stuff, or with the phenomenon of homelessness as you constructed it, I think about, and I'm sorry, I'm struggling to say this, both because I think it's a core problem of modern life, but like, this person is acting out and behaving as though they are insane. Therefore, that must be why they are out here doing that. As opposed to even the momentary consideration that, independent of, individual history or genetics or anything, that why wouldn't being on the street and being unable to sleep and being treated like a disposable person drive a person mad?
Yeah.
Patrick, if you don't mind, I want to kind of take a little bit of what you're saying here with the purloined letter image, and also pick up a phrase that Brian was using earlier, which I think is really helpful, about the active production of invisibility. What turns out to be, in fact, the largest group of Americans suffering from homelessness. So this is a podcast about psychoanalysis and politics, and we are always talking one way or another about how things like repression occur on a political scale, and in like cultural imaginaries, not just at the level of the individual, like another way of getting away from the sort of individual pathology model, right? But I mean, you don't have to be a Freudian to read the overarching argument in the book as a vast, just like just devastatingly vast repression of the nature and scale of homelessness in contemporary America. And I want to read to our listeners this quotation, quote, "The evidence is clear. Homelessness is an exponentially bigger and more pervasive phenomenon than we have been led to believe. A conservative estimate of the actual number of people deprived of housing in the United States, those living in vehicles or hotel rooms or staying temporarily with others, along with people in shelters or on the street, would be well over 4 million. These numbers matter. If they didn't, there wouldn't be an attempt to systematically deflate them. An accurate accounting of homelessness in America produces an entirely different narrative, a different sense of who in this country is becoming homeless and why, close quote. And another obvious repression is the extent, and here is where I'm circling back to the purloined letter and to the active, production of invisibility. Another obvious repression is the extent to which the centrality of housing, right? The absence of affordable housing has been written out of both problem and solution in, just this kind of shocking act of prestidigitation, right? Like conceptual prestidigitation. And so I want to ask you, why do you think the thing that ought to be the most obvious or seemingly the most obvious part of this conversation, the fact that what people struggling to be housed need is housing, right? Why and how has that been so effectively obscured?
Mm. I just want to keep listening to the both of you think out loud about these things because I have no illusions about my capacity to provide like a comprehensive analysis. And it really truly is like incredible to just hear both of you thinking about this. But since I assume you want me to talk a little bit, I will reluctantly talk and say that, yeah, God, there's so much to say in response to that. First of all, I think that it is its own kind of intervention just to like say that what has been repressed to some extent is like the term housing as opposed to like home or homelessness. Home has all sorts of like other existential, even ontological, intonations, implication, like home means belonging, home means all these other, there's all sorts of like Heideggerian directions you could go in with home and shelter and this kind of refuge and housing is different. Housing has kind of a brute materiality to it. Like to say that homelessness is a housing problem is to really like immediately take us to a more kind of mundane and banal realm of like who is producing housing, what is it for, who's being deprived of it, who is profiting off of it. And so in some ways that's already an answer to the question, like because once you open up that more like basic political economic category, you begin to see that the reason this has been repressed, and this has less to do, I think, with housing per se than with all of these other sort of uniquely American maladies. And that is to say that, to open up that question is to be forced to confront American style racial capitalism in all of its glory, and all of its inflicted suffering and engineered abandonment, and the active like creation and production of populations that are not accidentally but by design disposable and expendable. I think that that's one way to begin answering the question, is just to say that like both at the scale of the nation and at the scale of, I think, even individuals, like there's a profound fear and discomfort around being forced to encounter that reality, to see the myths around meritocracy and work ethic, sort of exploded in this way. The very term working homeless, I think, is so discomforting and kind of astonishing, shocking to people, precisely because it in many ways, America, you could like tell the history of America through this age old and just deeply pernicious distinction between the deserving and undeserving poor. We have predicated so much social policy on that distinction. And it has done so much harm. And it is so tenacious and it is so bipartisan. And I think the term working homeless, like, it's not to say, oh, okay, here's this population of folks who like we can have more sympathy for because they're working, because they're part of the labor force, because they're doing everything quote unquote right. It's to say that even those who are working their asses off, who are working and working, and it's still not enough, even for those people, even those people who have like said, okay, these are the rules. I'm going to play by the rules. I'm going to be plunged into this low wage labor force. Even those people like can't secure this most basic human need. And so I think it's unsettling because of how it explodes that distinction and shows it to be the kind of lie that it has always been. And it's also, I think, really unsettling because, and here again, I'm talking about the term working homeless. It's also unsettling because it shows how incredibly porous the line separating housed from unhoused actually is in this country. Like, I think on a psychic level, we have needed to segregate homelessness, not just geographically and spatially in like skid rows, areas of the city that are kind of out of sight and out of mind, and over there somewhere. But we've done that on a psychic level as well. Like we've needed people who are homeless to be other and like we've needed homelessness to be this kind of condition, almost like as part of this like Greek tragedy where you're just like struck with something. And we've needed homelessness to be that because if it wasn't, if we saw it in its reality, like it would be really fucking scary for not just like those who are poor and working class, but like the downwardly mobile middle class as well, which is a huge portion of this country right now. So I think like that's also really, really scary. And it's part of what's fueling that repression is like, it's really hard to confront the looming possibility that like, quote unquote, we are actually much more like, quote, them than we might want to acknowledge.
That seems so profound and on point. I find myself thinking about that recurrent sort of like there for the grace of God go I, right? Except instead of that injunction inspiring you to do charity or empathize, it's like, thank God that's not me, fuck them. Like there's this kind of
Yes.
additional, like as the social safety net phrase, as we get into this sort of neoliberal moment or this thoroughly, like whatever the hell this nightmare is, where like the only thing that seems to trickle down is malice. Like
Yeah.
all these things have previously seemed like appeals for solidarity instead become opportunities for like, I guess, like disidentification and owning somebody in some way. Like there is this kind of what I find myself thinking about, and again, I think this is like one of the hardest things to talk about. I think because it implicates so many things that are both psychic and discursive and political economic at the same time that it feels like, well, the abundance discourse to take an example of this, right? Or to the then I don't even necessarily want to get into that text unless you want to talk about it. But like this
I
sort
don't want to talk
okay, we don't
about
want to
it.
talk about it. Okay, good. That's fine. We can all agree not to we don't need to move copies of that. But like the people who will talk about professionals whose job it is to both present quote unquote solutions to problems, but also kind of diffuse the possibility of structural transformation or thinking about how problems may be related as uh, effects to causes that they would rather us not think too hard about, let alone that might, affect their paycheck. Even those sort of appeals seem to be haunted by the specter of well being rendered disposable or falling through the cracks, right? And I mean this in the sense that if someone were to be like, well, why don't the homeless just move to a special economic zone? Well, why don't people who have worked in the mines just now learn how to code in Ruby and Visual Basic or whatever the hell the latest thing is, right? And even independent of how those things actually just basically make coding a blue collar job, or that flies in the face of what moving actually means, what that also seems to do is kind of express this sort of wish, both about the other and the self, being like, well, if I was capable of moving from the Bay Area to Georgetown, right? If I can jet set between, TED Talks or whatever the hell it is, why can't they, right? I'm living good life rightly. So clearly they can do that too. And yet that's haunted by, I think, the implication that people can just be like plucked up and moved in this kind of fungible way. And of course, for the people who are you're writing about, who I do think like work harder than anyone I can imagine in that other set. Like just the 90-hour weeks.
Yeah, we're talking minimal sleep. We're talking multiple jobs. We're talking, waking up at 3 a.m. Yeah. Tiredness. I mean, I feel like I would be remiss if we didn't say that just exhaustion, fatigue beyond fatigue is a really important part of all of these people's lives, right?
Yeah. And if I could just interject really quick to say that, like, behind behind each of these stories, each of these families in the book, like are a set of like statistics that that provide a kind of like bedrock reality of like and an immediate rejoinder to like anyone who would say, yeah, why don't they just move somewhere else? So like just to cite these statistics really quickly, like the National Low Income Housing Coalition has pointed out that right now in the US, there isn't a single city, state, or metro area where someone working full-time at the local minimum wage, which is often higher than the federal minimum wage, where someone working the local minimum wage full-time can afford just like a modest apartment. Nowhere in America. So there's that. There's just this idea that like, the line of like, well, why don't they go somewhere cheaper, somewhere more affordable, that like there is nowhere else to go. Like if you do go somewhere that is like cheaper in terms of the rents, because obviously not all rents in the nation are as high as like New York or San Francisco, like you're going to also be earning less per hour, and transportation costs might be higher because you have to drive a car and so forth. So there really is increasingly nowhere to go. Another statistic is that since 1985, rents have outpaced income gains nationwide by 325%. Just like a mind-blowing figure. And yeah, and every year the National Low Income Housing Coalition, they calculate what's called the housing wage needed to afford, again, just like a modest apartment in any given city in the country. And as of the most recent year, 2024, the national housing wage was roughly $32 an hour. And the federal minimum wage is $7.25 an hour. The last time the minimum wage was raised was 2009. So $32 an hour, $7.25 an hour. And yes, like it is higher in particular cities, the minimum wage, but nowhere is the minimum wage $32 an hour. So there's just like, and if you have SSI, if you're disabled and dependent on this form of fixed income, there isn't a single place in the entire country where SSI, which is capped at, I believe, $967 a month right now, nowhere where that is enough to afford rent. And you're not even allowed to like work extra hours to supplement your income with SSI. So like, this is like just the basic foundation upon which these stories emerge. Yeah, this is like the brute, like horrific arithmetic that is like pulling is just like looming over all of these stories in the book.
I keep finding myself thinking about that old like Twitter joke, which was like, the effects are bad, but the causes are good, right?
Yeah.
And I feel like on this issue in particular, but also in so many other different domains, people kind of do get the causes are bad too. And so much of the actual quote unquote work around it is really our workarounds, in the sense that it's like, well,
Yeah.
maybe the causes actually aren't related to the effects, or maybe we can keep having the causes and just reclassify the effects, or maybe what if we took the effects and made them into a new set of causes? Like, there's a whole lot of different shell games that seem increasingly to underscore the fact, and this is something I found myself really sitting with your text, how people can live next to one another and be on different planets, or be in, sort of inhabit different worlds in terms of how they're forced to interact with institutions, or the failures of various fantasies or narratives. And yet, even as they move alongside one another and they know that the others exist, something prevents them, or at least prevents the people with power more often than not, from being aware of what else is just around the corner or could come for them. And the moment that really sort of took my breath away, among the many in your text, was your discussing the impact of COVID on
Mhm.
the housing experiences and the experiences of work. And when Natalia, one of the people you follow, is having the experience, was you write, she took comfort in reading articles, particularly first-person accounts, about the difficulties others were facing. It helped her to remember that millions of people were also struggling to cope, that a communal, quote, we was also on the verge of going nuts. But then she would read a personal essay about sourdough starters or backyard camping or binge Netflix shows, and the limits of collective identification became brutally clear. She couldn't even open their hotel room window more than a couple of inches, and the sluggish internet connection made any effort to stream movies a frustrating endeavor.
Yeah. Yep. Just one thought that occurs to me is that, like, when and this might just be another byproduct, another manifestation of that repression we were talking about a moment ago. But it occurs to me that when we do acknowledge the existence of the other, in this sense, when we do acknowledge the existence of our neighbors and what they are going through, the options we've been given are themselves a kind of blackmail. Like, the options are either judgment, like that's the dominant one, criminalization, everything on that side of the binary, criminalization, judgment. Now, rounding people up and putting them in warehouses and detention camps, which is what our political leaders on, across the political spectrum would like to do. But on the other side of the binary, it's like just as depraved in its own way, because on that other side of the binary is charity. And that charity has become, and whether it's like really big acts of charity, or just going and handing out Christmas presents once a year at your local shelter or whatever, handing out socks and canned goods or whatever it is, like it is, that in itself is an indication of how hijacked our moral and political imagination has become, right? Like, that charity, that the predicament would even be framed in terms of like a problem in need of charity, and not an injustice in need of rectification and
Yeah.
reparation. Like, so that just occurs to me that even the most like well-meaning versions of like responding to homelessness in America take the form not of justice, but of this kind of benevolence, and the fact that like philanthropy, big philanthropy, is really what dictates and determines so much of what passes for like policy and solutions where these issues are concerned. Hopefully we can just dig a little bit more into solutions, but that in itself, I think, is so symptomatic of how impoverished the the entire like thinking around homelessness has become.
Before we do turn to thinking about solutions, and I will say that I think where the book ends in the epilogue, which I went back and I like reread after I finished the book, that there are both theoretical resources and practical resources here, right? This book is diagnostic, but it is not only diagnostic. And so I'm eager to get to that. But first, I want to talk about one other aspect of the book that I really admired, which is the way that you're toggling continuously between this acute attention to people's material needs. But you're doing that without neglecting their psychic needs. Material precarity and psychic precarity, like you make this abundantly clear throughout the book. These are not things that can be disentangled. And as the book wears on, and as readers, we get to know the people that you're tracking better and better. The psychic tolls of coping with these endless struggles loom large, both for individuals' own self-conceptions. I mean, I think we talked about this a little bit in terms of self-judgment, right? That no one could be a harsher judge of some of the folks that you're talking about than themselves.
Mm.
But it's also the psychic costs for their relationships with their friends, with their families, with strangers, with lovers, with bosses, and not just individuals, but like say with activist organizations, with institutions. Can you talk a little bit about that toll and how it manifested for the folks you follow in the book? And by the same token, how did you find yourself processing their stories as you followed them? As I mean, you said this is 5 years of reporting. Like that's 5 years of your life as well.
Yeah. In some ways, like this is the hardest thing to talk about because it was the most wrenching thing to witness, I think, in real time. And I guess I'll get back to that to the latter part of your question about just how I processed this to the extent I did. Patrick alluded to this earlier, like the harm of capturing someone or thinking that you're capturing someone, thinking you're understanding someone when you see them in a particular moment, in a particular state. So like, even when you see, I mean, it's undeniable that so many of the people suffering most visibly on the street are in the throes of, psychological distress, like really extreme psychological distress or substance use or other things. And one of the reasons why it felt so important to track with people for such a long period of time, to expand the temporal frame and to not just capture them in a moment, but to like expand that frame, to expand the lens, was to see how contingent and accidental and avoidable that psychic distress was, like that deterioration, how preventable, how avoidable that was. And so like it was really important to open Michelle's story with her wearing her Santa hat on Christmas Eve and like dancing in the kitchen to Michael Jackson with her son DJ, and making Christmas Eve dinner for her kids, and like that the chapter ends not in this like spectacular fashion, but with the family, she and her fiance and her kids like building a gingerbread house. Like that wasn't that was very deliberate, because what later happens to Michelle, like how she begins to disintegrate as the book goes on, and to the point where if you were to encounter her in the MARTA station at the end of the book, when she's sleeping in that station, you would wrongly assume that she's been in that state for years, and that the alcoholism that she's now in the grip in is the reason why she's sleeping in that station, not a consequence of it, not a byproduct of it. And so, yeah, I mean that is a reality that I think is repeated in various versions in all of these stories, and not just with the parents, but the kids too. And that is why it's so fucking. I mean, there's no words for what it's like to see parents and their kids like just kind of like disappearing before your eyes. I think of like that in Back to the Future. Michael J. Fox is holding that photo, and it's like people are just like becoming less and less material and substantial. Like they're, and I think that's how they felt. Like that's what they, in various ways, were trying. Even DJ, through his poetry later in the book, he's like, everyone is trying to articulate what it feels like to feel oneself disappearing or becoming unrecognizable. And Kara's another one who I think really illustrates this. Like, it gets to a point
She's
where,
the one that made me write this question.
yeah, Kara's story. I mean, I think her story is the most difficult for me to talk about. I'm still just coming to terms with it. There's so much like in these families' journeys where like anyone hearing what they're going through would say like, oh, they're exaggerating, or oh, surely like what sounds to be a conspiracy like isn't truly a conspiracy. Like surely there's some kind of delusion going on here. And then no, like you find out that Kara's light bills, after going through this like a protracted period of homelessness with her kids, and after driving for 10, 11, 12 hours a day DoorDash with her kids in the car during the pandemic just to avoid being on the street, after this grueling journey, she finally gets into an apartment, and then she's getting these light bills in the slum apartment that she's now renting. She's getting these light bills for like $800, $700 a month. And she's going to the power company, and they're like, oh, it's the apartment complex's fault. And she goes to the apartment complex, oh, it's the power company's fault. Meanwhile, she's the one responsible for paying these bills every month, or else she'll have the lights turned on. And at one moment, she's actually sleeping in her car outside of an apartment whose rent she has paid that month, running the air conditioner in her car, wasting precious gas because the lights have been turned off, because it's the summer, because she doesn't have air conditioner, because the lights have been turned off, because she couldn't pay her bill. All the food in her refrigerator and freezer is spoiling. And, during that period, like we were actually out of touch during some of the most wrenching periods. Like one reality in all of this is that I often lost touch with people during the most harrowing moments. Like in her case, in Kara's case, she kind of withdrew. She just like, as she put it, like went into her shell when these things happened, when she really felt like she was going crazy. She went into her shell, and then her cell phone got turned off. And so I lost touch with her. And it was only later that I found out that she had been sleeping in her car outside of this apartment. Like it's just, like that sounded crazy to me when she told me. And then I realized, no, that actually happened. I went with her to the power company. So it's like the line between reality and unreality is so thin here. And then there are points where Kara actually does begin having delusions about people out to get her. And I think, just to put a cap on this with Kara, like, I mean, one of the most just what the fuck moments in all of this reporting was Kara finally gets to the point where she's like, okay, I want to see a therapist. I need a therapist. I need help. Like she feels herself disintegrating. And I remember the day that I was with her, she called the Medicaid number because she thought she had Medicaid. And she calls the Medicaid number to find out like which therapist in her area, would accept Medicaid. And she's told by the person on the other end of the phone that, sorry, you only had health coverage like while you were pregnant. Your kids have health care under Peach Care, but you don't. So not only are you not eligible for any primary care or any therapy, no mental health services at all. So it's like her one attempt to like, okay, I need help. I need someone to help me process this. What she's told is covered by her form of healthcare by the state is contraception and sterilization and STD treatment. Like basically eugenics is covered by the state. Everything else she's left to fend for herself. And yeah, like the implication here is that, in a couple of years, when we walk by someone on the street and she is talking to herself or she seems out of her mind, like that is Kara. That is Kara untreated. That is Kara who was so desperate to get help and was systematically denied help. Like that is what we have created. And as you can hear in my voice talking about this, like, yeah, I'm still coming to terms with what it was like to just watch this and witness this, and to see, like, what public health researchers refer to as the toxic stress that these kids are exposed to, and the ways that that strangles their futures, and how it just like corrodes their mental health, and their educational opportunities and so much else. I didn't have a good way of processing this. I think, to be quite honest, like for a long time, because I was so minimizing the effect that this was having on me, because at the end of the day, I was able to return home to my family and have this kind of elsewhere to rejuvenate, or to think I was rejuvenating. I really minimized the toll it was taking on me, and it would just spill out in these really ugly ways. I would like have these random fits of like bad temper with my kids, or like just be really moody. And yeah, I did not have a good way of processing it. I really was careful to like, stay away from drinking and other drugs, because I knew that like that could easily, I felt myself just needing something like that. I didn't have a good way. Like eventually my wife and my editor and other friends sort of staged an intervention. They're like, you have to go to therapy. And because I had the resources to see a therapist, I did, and it ended up being really crucial to me even being able to finish this book, because there were many points where I was just like, I can't even go on. Like I can't even, the thought of just putting these words on the page seemed impossible. So yeah, I know that's not the tidiest answer, but I guess it's the most honest one.
Yeah. No, I mean, and it makes so much sense. And I mean, I think, one of the things that struck me, and again, that led me thinking about Kara in particular, who is maybe the individual in the book that I don't know, I guess I, as a reader, like became like invested in immediately, the most invested in immediately, is that there is an absolutely crystalline logic to the ways in which, like, as you say, she starts to disappear. But it's not just that, is she becomes paranoid. But if you have an endless series of encounters with faceless bureaucracies that intend to help you or claim to intend to help you, and instead put you in 5, 6 different ways, at least, counting charitably, into Kafkaesque situations where the possibility of trusting a stranger, trusting an institution becomes ludicrous.
Yeah.
Well, of
Yeah.
course, like if everything is so frayed, then of course, like not only are you going to start to feel paranoid, and is that paranoia going to be like quite a logical outgrowth of your own experiences, but of course your relationships with the people that you do trust, right? The people that are the closest to you. If you yourself are so frayed, and if the experience of interpersonal relationships you have is one that is just of continual like fraying, well, like not to like double down on the metaphor, but like the rope breaks,
Hmm.
right?
Hmm. Hmm. Yeah.
There was something about that story where it made so clear to me the ways in which, as Patrick was talking about, and as you were talking about, and as you wrote about, I think really, really beautifully and really piercingly, we have these things backwards. The idea that people become homeless because of their mental health.
Hmm.
And
Hmm.
your book is 400 pages of the most madness creating
Hmm.
situations where, I mean, that going back and forth between the power company and this and that and the other thing. I mean, it's just like double binds on double binds on double binds. And then the moment that somebody would get a lead on somebody who was going to help them, they would go there. And half the time it would turn out to be a scam or a
Mhm.
grift.
Yeah.
And the other time it would turn out to be the right people and they would say, you're not homeless enough for us to help you.
Yeah. Yeah. And how at every turn in their journey, there are entire business models designed not only to capitalize and profit off of their precarity, but to exacerbate it, to
Yes.
ensure that this does not end, to ensure that it is like perpetual, because then the profitability will be perpetual as well. Like, and just running the gamut from like really small operations like these co-signing companies that, now are profiting off of people's low credit scores, or like storage units that are just utterly extractive and predatory, and to like these private equity firms that are buying up not just like vast swaths of rental housing and making it more insecure, but like the very places where people go once they lose their housing, like these extended stay hotels. Like Blackstone and Starwood Capital spent $6 billion buying Extended Stay America during the pandemic because they saw how profitable it was. And Natalia and Maurice, when they spend $17,000 in the span of 8 months at this in the shitty studio-sized hotel room, which is more than double what they had been spending down the street for a two-bedroom apartment. Like at the very moment that they are spending that money, Blackstone and Starwood Capital are like buying that same chain of hotels. And like, so, we're familiar with the James Baldwin line about how extremely expensive it is to be poor in America. And I think these family stories show, not just a Kafkaesque reality that even Kafka would be like, wait, this is too much. This is too Kafkaesque. But like the flip side of that Baldwin line, which is like how extremely lucrative all of this precarity has become for some. And Abby, if I could just also mention, like, you talked about just people, it's like not even being able to understand what is happening to them, these faceless entities, these like inscrutable entities, ineffable entities in many ways. That reminds me of what Carla Wells, a case manager in the book, talks about, where she's like, after years and years of being in the trenches of homeless services, I'm seeing like what my clients need most. Yes, they need money. They certainly don't need financial literacy classes and money management and, parenting classes. Money is good. Like they need more money. They need more resource. But what they really need is power, because it's the powerlessness. It's like not just the powerlessness to like, ameliorate their material circumstances, but to just grasp, to just like understand who the hell is this wizard behind the curtain that is making all of this misery so pervasive and impenetrable. Like what, and just connecting the dots. And so for me, like writing this book in some ways became, for the families themselves, a kind of like, here, let me just show you a kind of architecture of why you went through this. Like, and to show others, and because the roughly 4 million people currently homeless in this country, and the 12.1 million households right now at this moment who are at immediate risk of being pushed into homelessness because they fit this category of severely cost burdened and worst case housing needs. And like, let's show that population the architecture of why they are experiencing this, that this isn't, in the same way that healthcare used to be sort of depoliticized. Like if you went bankrupt because you got cancer and couldn't pay your medical bills, like that was seen as like an individual failure. But like one of the virtues of the last couple of decades is like where American politics is concerned, is that like healthcare is now rightly politicized. And I think too often when people are deprived of housing, it's still seen as just like, well, like I should have tried harder.
I must say, just in terms of my own reading the book emotionally and thinking of you writing it and thinking of the people living it that you were writing about, in addition to these feelings of of care and consideration and oftentimes dread, like that sense that I knew there was going to be something, there was going to be some sort of shoe that would drop, and even their sympathy when they were exhausted with these institutions, and yet still they would continue to show up and go far beyond again anything I think I could. I also found myself feeling this kind of rage, whether it's the scene where one of the people you follow goes before a judge, ready to
Kara, yeah.
when she's ready to describe how her landlord hasn't attended to basic like water and heating concerns for months, and the judge essentially is like, well, actually, no, you failed to pay your rent this last month, so of course she's withholding it because she doesn't get basic water, or the truly sort of nightmarish denouement of what plays out in one of the efficiency situations that you describe, where essentially paramilitaries swarm it to evict people, and even their duly elected representative is like, well, this is we can't help you. This is disgusting, but the nature of the laws here are such that even though you might think you have rights as tenants, there's a particular because you've been here for so long, there's a particular carve out, no doubt produced by various lobbyists, to mean that you have even less rights than you would if you were simply staying in a hotel. And at the point at which even a fucking like the police officer or the chief or whatever it is that you describe is like, you're taking this better than I would. I don't know what this is wrong. Like I can't go on the like even when the fucking cops are saying that.
Yes.
My sense both of, again, horror and dread, which is about more than what was happening to them, but the sense like, oh, this is abstruse, sort of like discursive, sort of like cul-de-sacs about what is or isn't fascism, right? Like at the point, or what is or isn't going to happen versus what, is our worst nightmares of what might happen to us, whatever that us means. Like the scenes of the paramilitary kicking people out of their house because of this sort of vicious set of double binds that are really just about making sure that the rentier class can extract more, that felt like both so clearly where things are headed, but also so clearly where things already are and have been, that the feelings of horror and rage were almost overwhelming. But
yes,
it was this takeaway that I had, which was not only is this suffering that is so legible, even when it becomes paranoia, but like that paranoia is authorized by the fact that there actually are bad actors out there. Like even as we are talking abstractly about systems and abstract incentives, there are bad actors who are seizing the opportunity to shape the system going forward. And that impunity with which they're doing it, again, at the point at which even the enforcers of the state, people who have qualified immunity in Georgia, are like, this is immoral.
Yeah.
Is such a clear bare minimum in terms of demanding some kind of moral or political response that, again, and I think here, and where I'm trying to go with this, is this theme that I think is really being crystallized by our conversation, which is that if there is such a thing as a social contract, even as like a concept, right? At its best, it would be a collective decision or a recognition of the fact that some things should not happen to anyone, anywhere, no matter the circumstances.
Yeah.
And yet, we seem to be in this moment where that has, through a kind of alchemical transmutation or a series of anxieties or incentives, become, well, at least I can agree, anxiously uttered, that for now, it's not happening to me, so I guess it's okay. So like the change of an aspirational universal rights calculus into a kind of like pact of just being able to get by is just seems to be, it has to be rejected on every possible level. And I want to just say the work that you've done, I think, which is righteous, made me feel that in a way that I have not felt in a long time.
Yeah. I will say that rage, anger was my dominant emotion over the years working on this book. Just like an unremitting rage and unremitting anger mixed with just profound grief, profound sadness, and which is in some ways a melancholia because of how difficult it was throughout that time to like see the forest for the trees and to like have a source. I mean, like the anger when I was immersed in it just was so often kind of objectless because like of how immersed I was, and in some ways like I had to, I mean, maybe this goes back to how I processed it, but like just kind of trying to piece together the the systems that were making this possible and the people profiting off it, like that wasn't necessarily, again, going back to like how hidden and the sense of powerlessness that people have to even understand what's happening. I think I experienced a degree of that as well. And so I say melancholia just because of how like the grief didn't even have like an, in time it felt inarticulable. And yeah, yeah. And I think the book is my attempt to kind of begin to articulate why that rage and sadness was so present throughout this process.
I mean, I think both the grief and the rage come through just throughout the book. And I want to say, and I think this is important to say, that this is before we wind up, is that even though a lot of this book is unremittingly bleak, part of that rage also, I think, leads to a sense, which is also throughout the book, which is it does not have to be this way.
Yes.
Right.
Yeah.
And I was thinking almost as Patrick was talking about about something that a therapist said to me long ago about how like part of the therapeutic process within a given session is like, if you are going to completely take people apart, you have to help them find a way to get back together, at least enough, you know what I mean? Like
Yes.
that's part of the job. And I see this book as, so much of it is, again, it's diagnostic, but what you're doing by fundamentally redefining homelessness is also saying like, here's an analysis that will shape the ways that we have to attack this problem because we've been understanding it wrong. And I think that you do this in two related ways. And I want to ask you to tell our listeners more about both of these. So first, and I think this is going to be, the first is going to be really clear and resonant to a lot of our listeners who have heard us talk a lot about the ways in which not we as in the three of us, but in this cultural landscape that we live in, we have an infinite amount of respect for property, but almost none for people. And so what you're doing is talking about how housing needs to be understood not as commodity, but as human right. And you're also talking about something called social housing. So I'm hoping that you can tell us, in the mode of putting us a little bit back together, about the vision of the first of these things, of reconceiving housing not as commodity, but as human right, and how that can translate into reality in the form of social housing, which, as you point out, is very much a reality in places like Vienna in particular, in Austria, but also in Finland.
As an anthropologist, I subscribe to an idea of anthropology. There are like these two kind of competing ideas of anthropology. One is that anthropology is about making the strange familiar, going off somewhere and like translating practices and cultural habits and so forth into terms that we, will understand. I mean, there's a kind of imperialist force animating that idea of anthropology, but there's a more interesting idea of anthropology, I think, which is about making the familiar strange. And that's an idea of anthropology that can maybe also be said of like a kind of mandate for psychoanalysis. I think Adam Phillips somewhere uses a similar sort of conception of psychoanalysis as like, that is the
it
basic
makes it uncanny.
maneuver.
Yeah.
And so nowhere for me is like that operation or that impetus more urgent to make the familiar strange than when it comes to housing. I think my hope is that in reading this book, like everyone who reads it will sort of become anthropologists and drop down into our society that we've created for ourselves and just say, how the fuck have we allowed this to happen? Like, how have we taken this basic human necessity, a place to live, and allowed it to just be hoarded up and then like auctioned off to the highest bidder. And how have we allowed what Carla Wells, that same case manager who I mentioned earlier, how have we allowed what she calls the housing Hunger Games to become our norm, our status quo, where we've said, like, we're going to leave this basic human need to the private market, to the whims of the market, to the fluctuations of the market, and whatever the market can bear, like that's what will become sort of normal for us. And everyone else is just like fucked. Like, how have we allowed that to happen? I remember during the pandemic, there were these two brothers in Tennessee who were like driving around to all the Dollar Generals buying up hand sanitizer. And then they were like, selling, they got a U-Haul and they put all these hand sanitizers in there, and then they were like selling it on eBay and Amazon for like 80-90 bucks a pop, and people were rightly outraged, and they made the front page of newspapers, and there were calls for them to be prosecuted. And I remember reading that and thinking, like, as I was following these family stories, I remember reading that thinking, like, that is exactly what we've allowed housing to become. But we don't call it price gouging. We don't call it hoarding. We call it supply and demand economics. We call it the market. And so I think, first of all, like, that is the revelation that we all need to kind of undergo and experience, is just like a revelation of like how utterly absurd and weird is it that this is how we've treated this, this essential human societal good, a place to live. And in many ways, like, this isn't me coming up with this. This is like an entire, as grim, as unremittingly bleak as things are right now, where these issues are concerned, like it has spawned what, for me, a really big source of hope, which is like a very vibrant tenant rights movement, a movement of tenant organizing, of tenant unions, and tenants themselves are even like bridging the gap between those who have housing and those who don't, and referring, like the LA Tenants Union, they refer to those who are homeless as unhoused tenants, because all of them, like across the spectrum, are dependent on property owners for a place to live. Those who are on the streets or in other unhoused situations simply are at the moment like on the extreme end of that that situation. But we're all dependent on someone else for just a place to live. And I think that movement of housing rights and housing justice is what is also allowing the blinders to come off, and for us to ask ourselves, like, how has this happened? And part of why it was so important and continues to be so important for those in power, again, this is a bipartisan project, for those in power to sort of diminish not only the scale, but to distort the causes of homelessness, is because once you see it in its reality, then we can no longer trick ourselves into thinking that, like, some pairs of socks or a few tiny homes over here or a couple of supportive housing units over there are anywhere close to meeting this catastrophe at scale. Once we see the scale and once we see the true causes, a different set of solutions become necessary. And there's a whole range of solutions that can be implemented like immediately right now, just like low-hanging policy fruit, like basic habitability requirements, or a right to counsel in eviction cases, solutions that would both keep people in the homes they currently have and get them into homes they don't yet have. But ultimately, as you alluded to, like, where I land at the end of this book is with social housing. It's like public housing done right. It's public housing that wasn't set up to fail, that wasn't systematically defunded and sort of allowed to deteriorate through this kind of engineered neglect. Public housing that wasn't like where poverty wasn't concentrated. And this model has really flourished in Vienna. It's flourished in Finland, in Singapore. And basically, it's like what they're doing in these countries is they're building permanently affordable, dignified, safe housing on government-owned land. And the government is in the housing business. In the 80s, one of Reagan's HUD deputies said, the federal government is getting out of the housing business, period. And I guess what I want to suggest modestly is that like this catastrophe will continue to spiral until the government gets back into the housing business, until we stop, there's this idea that if we just deregulate the private market, if we just cut the red tape, if we just sort of let developers and landlords do their thing, like people's needs will be taken care of. And that's exactly what that HUD deputy was suggesting in the 80s. And we are now suffering through the consequences of that. So, I mean, we need solutions. We need everything on the table. And I do think that like zoning restrictions are rooted in a history of racism and protecting, home values for the wealthiest people in our cities. So yes, I do think that those zoning regulations need to be undone. But do I think that just letting the market do its thing is going to solve this problem? Absolutely not. So yeah, social housing is where my hope lies in all of this.
I think what really hit me at the end of your book was how the case that you just made emerges imminently from the text itself, without any heavy-handed jargon or buzzwords in the body of the narrative. A narrative which, again, I think reads like it reminded me of like Upton Sinclair or Zola or Stephen Thrasher, like any of these people who for me are painters isn't even the right word, but can conjure a social landscape and recognize the humanity in people that is otherwise being, well, the word humanized is not appropriate because they have that humanity, right? In other words, what I guess I'm trying to push back against or emerge with a different rearticulation of is precisely this work of making what is in front of our faces but disavowed visible, but also how doing that crystallizes and makes obvious what should be. Namely, this injunction, as you just articulated it, that well, if we have a state and it should exist for any reason, why is it not doing this? Like this is a bare minimum thing.
Yeah, yeah.
And at that point, I wanted to just acknowledge and commend and recommend the book to others, but to commend you in producing this, which is so powerfully straightforward and yet also, I think, something that will continue to sit, I know with me, and I imagine with a great many other readers, an active witnessing and a kind of testimony that in addition to laying out these positive, clear, programmatic, undeniable policy consequence, also seems like an exercise in the psychic labor or work, not just imagining these things politically or promulgating them policy-wise, but of simply sitting with what is so overwhelmingly disavowed and so distressing, and sitting with it until it actually, well, produces something,
Yeah.
or it forces a recognition. And I think it's
a remarkable thing.
It's so rare and so necessary. So I wanted to thank you for that.
Oh, thank you. Thank you. This conversation itself is like, I mean, yeah, I just can't tell you how much this means to me.
Brian, before we go, where can people find the book? Where can people find you on the internet?
This feels like the part in the therapy session where like you're still crying and the therapist is like, so how's August 4th looking for you?
It's been
and you're just like
50
abruptly
minutes.
pulled out of your reverie. But yeah, I forgot that this is about a book. On my website, briangoldstone.net. But everything you've said about the book in our conversation is like basically all I want to be said about the book. So yes, thank you so much.
Well, thank you.
Thank you.
It's
Truly.
just an incredible book, and it was so wonderful to get to talk with you.
Likewise.
Thank you so much for listening to Ordinary Unhappiness. If you'd like to support the show, which is completely made possible by our generous Patreon community, which also helps keep it ad-free for everyone to listen to, please head over and find us at patreon.com/ordinaryunhappiness. You'll also get 2 additional paywalled episodes per month, including our Wild Analysis series and our March Through Freud's entire standard edition. This has been an episode of Ordinary Unhappiness, a podcast about psychoanalysis, politics, pop culture, and the ways we suffer now. I'm Abby Kluchin, and today I was joined by Patrick Blanchfield and Brian Goldstone. This podcast is produced by Dan Yowell. Theme music by Formal Chicken.